because unknowingly Josh would end up capturing his own murder, and what would ensue in the hours following would be a relentless hunt to figure out.
With us, like recording, we was walking to the street.
Tragically, these are the last words Josh ever speaks, because as 11 shots ring out, the only sounds uttered are terrified, panicked.
Call the police. He handed me fake money. He's trying to steal the bike. Call the police. You are listening to 41-year-old Josh Swink's voice. He is recording 18-year-old Oscar Vega Aguirre. What Josh doesn't know is that his phone is capturing the last moments of his life. The transaction had seemed routine, a dirt bike for sale, a buyer with cash. But the cash was counterfeit. And when Josh confronted him, Oscar didn't run, he chased. 2 gunshots to the back, while Josh tried to retreat. The phone kept recording. What would drive an 18-year-old to murder a father of 3 over fake bills? The answer would come only after Oscar led investigators through a maze of lies. But this story begins earlier that morning, when Josh Swink had no reason to believe this Saturday would be different from any other. On the morning of October 14th, 2023, Josh Swink had no reason to believe this Saturday would be different from any other. Josh Swink, 41, father of 3. Spent that Saturday morning doing what felt like any other weekend errand, selling his dirt bike from the driveway of his Hiram, Georgia home. The CRF 450 sat in the sun, chrome catching light, while a string of potential buyers came and went. Some kicked the tires, some asked about mileage. Most made offers well below the listing price. His phone rang throughout the morning, conversations about specs, condition, add-ons. Could they test ride it? Would he take 800? What about a trade? Josh answered each call with the same calm patience, walking buyers through what the bike had and what it didn't, what he'd take and what he wouldn't. Samantha Swink, his wife, moved through the house with their children, planning the Dunkin' run they'd make later that morning. The sounds of an ordinary Saturday. Voices in the driveway, the phone ringing, buyers examining the bike, filtered through the windows. Nothing urgent. Nothing that required her attention. Josh had a habit whenever a deal felt uncertain. He'd pull out his phone and hit record. Security cameras already captured the driveway, but he wanted his own documentation. Audio of the conversation, video of the transaction, proof of what was said and what wasn't. It was a small precaution, the kind of thing most people would call overly cautious, maybe even unnecessary. Keep that detail in mind. By mid-morning, he'd fielded 6 calls, maybe 7. Some buyers showed up, looked the bike over, and left without making an offer. Others called to negotiate before they'd even seen it. Nothing about any of these calls sounded different from the ones before. The bike wasn't moving fast, but Josh wasn't concerned. The right buyer would come along. Someone who saw the value, understood the condition, and didn't waste time with lowball offers. Until then, he'd keep answering the phone, keep walking people through the specs. Keep the bike clean and visible in the driveway where the next interested buyer could see it. Inside the house. Samantha checked the time. Their Dunkin' run could wait. Josh was still occupied with the bike, still fielding calls, still moving through the slow, patient rhythm of a private sale. The day stretched ahead with no urgency, no deadline, no reason to rush. But one more call would come that morning, a buyer agreeing to the asking price, willing to meet at 1 o'clock. Josh had no way of knowing it was the call that mattered. The one that would change everything. By 1:33 p.m., that buyer would be the last person Josh ever spoke to. At 1:33 that afternoon, Samantha's phone rang. Josh was down the block. His voice carried the urgency of a man managing a problem, giving clear instructions to someone who needed to act now. There was no greeting, no explanation beyond what mattered. Call the police. He handed me fake money. He's trying to steal the bike. Call the police.
Driving to view the dirt bike, but just minutes later he called his wife from down the block, demanding she call 911.
The buyer who had agreed to the asking price, who had shown up at 1 o'clock as promised, hadn't come to buy the bike at all. He'd come with counterfeit cash to steal it. Samantha was still processing the first sentence when Josh said the second, still trying to understand who he was talking about when the instruction repeated. Call the police, the bike, fake money, someone trying to take what didn't belong to them. She heard no background noise through the phone, no shouting, no confrontation, no sound of escalation. Just Josh's voice, steady and directive. The tone he used when something needed handling, and he was already handling it. Josh, what? The line went dead. Not a hang-up. Not the sound of him ending the call deliberately. Just the sudden silence of a connection that had been severed. Santa pulled the phone from her ear, looked at the screen. Call ended. 32 seconds. She stood in the driveway with her 5-year-old son beside her, phone still in her hand, waiting for it to ring again. For Josh to call back and finish what he'd started to tell her, to explain what had happened down the block, why someone would try to pay with fake bills, what he was doing about it. There was no fear in his voice that she could point to later, only urgency. The sound of a man handling something, not a man who believed he was in danger. That distinction would matter. Josh had called her to report a crime in progress, a theft attempt. Counterfeit money passed off as real. A buyer trying to take the bike without paying what it was worth. It was the kind of thing that happened sometimes in private sales. Scammers, lowlifes, people looking for an easy score. It wasn't the kind of thing that got anyone killed. Samantha dialed 911 as instructed. She gave the dispatcher what Josh had given her, someone trying to steal a dirt bike, fake money, her husband down the block dealing with it. The dispatcher asked for details she didn't have. Where exactly? What does the person look like? Is your husband in danger? She didn't know. He hadn't said. The call had lasted 32 seconds, and he'd used them to tell her what to do, not to describe what was happening. The phone didn't ring again. Minutes earlier, an 18-year-old had arrived at Josh's door, carrying more than just counterfeit cash. Minutes earlier, at around 1:30 that afternoon, the rideshare had pulled up to Josh's driveway. Oscar Vega Aguirre, 18 years old, arrived by rideshare from Union City, carrying a dark blue and black bag containing more than just the agreed-upon cash. He stepped out, paid the driver, and walked toward where Josh stood beside the CRF 450. Josh greeted him the way he'd greeted the half-dozen buyers before him that morning, polite, professional, ready to walk through the bike's condition. The chrome still caught the sun. The tires still held their tread. Nothing had changed since the last buyer left an hour ago. Oscar asked the questions buyers ask. How long had Josh owned it? Any mechanical issues? Why was he selling? Josh answered each one. He'd kept it clean, well maintained. No marks from being laid down. The bike was what it looked like, reliable, worth the asking price, no hidden problems waiting to surface after someone drove it off the property. The conversation followed the pattern of every private sale. Buyer examines the product, seller explains what makes it worth the money. Both parties circle the question of whether this is the right deal at the right price. Oscar seemed interested. More than that, ready. He said he had the cash, the full amount. No need to haggle or negotiate down. Just wanted to see the bike first. Make sure it matched what had been described over the phone. Josh walked him through the specs. Recent maintenance, oil changed, chain tensioned. Everything a buyer would want to know before handing over money for something that had to run the day they took possession. The listener already knows from Josh's 1:33 call how this ends. Every ordinary beat of the transaction now carries weight Oscar doesn't know is being counted. Oscar nodded along, asked a few more questions, circled the bike once, looking it over from both sides, then said what sellers want to hear. He'd take it, full price, cash ready. He lifted the dark blue and black bag. Josh had been through this before. Buyers showing up with cash in bags, envelopes, bundles held together with rubber bands. Private sales ran on whatever payment method both parties agreed to, and cash meant no waiting for checks to clear, no bank transfers to confirm. Simple. Final. Oscar handed him the bag. It had weight to it, the heft of bills stacked together, compressed into a container meant to carry exactly this kind of transaction. Josh took it from Oscar's hands and set it on the workbench near the driveway. Before anyone else in that driveway thought to look, he opened it. The bills were there, stacked, bundled, the right denominations visible on top. But something about them stopped his hand before he counted them. The texture, the colour, the way the ink sat on the surface. What he saw inside would change everything in the next 3 minutes. Josh had a habit when deals felt uncertain. He pulled out his phone and started recording. The bills felt wrong the moment Josh touched them. Not the weight, not the count, the texture. The ink sat on the surface differently than it should have. The colour off by a shade. Most people wouldn't notice unless they'd handled enough cash to know what real money felt like between their fingers. The cash Oscar handed over wasn't payment. It was counterfeit, mixed with just enough real bills to pass a quick glance. But Josh wasn't glancing. He was looking. He set the bills down on the workbench and reached for his phone. The habit that had kept him cautious through every uncertain transaction. Pull out the device, hit record. Document what's happening before it becomes a dispute about what was said or done. His phone came up. Camera active. Pointed directly at Oscar. Josh turned the confrontation into evidence, his phone now recording every word, every movement, trapping Oscar on camera. "You play that game?" Josh's voice carried the edge of a man who'd caught someone trying to cheat him. Not afraid, not backing down. "Bro, I'm recording you right now." Oscar's expression shifted. The calm buyer who'd asked polite questions about the bike's condition was gone. What replaced it was something sharper, more urgent. The recording changed the equation. Proof of the counterfeit cash, proof of who handed it over, proof that would follow Oscar long after he left this driveway. "Give me your goddamn phone. Now." Josh didn't lower the camera, didn't stop.
You play that game?
No, let me just call home. All right, then.
Bro, I'm recording you right now. You're going on Facebook. Police are on right now.
All right, bro.
This was the moment the documentation mattered, when someone wanted it erased, when the evidence became threatening enough that the other person demanded it back. "Give me the bag, give me the bag, give me the bag." Repetition, insistence, the tone of a man asserting control over a situation he believed he could still manage. A theft attempt, a scammer caught on camera, the kind of thing that ended with someone leaving empty-handed and Josh keeping both the bike and the counterfeit cash as proof of what had been tried. The habit that would later convict his killer was, in this moment, just a man standing his ground over what he thought was a theft he could handle. Oscar didn't leave, didn't back down, didn't hand over the bag. The recording continued. Josh's voice sharp, commanding, Oscar's rising, not apologetic, not negotiating, but demanding in return. The phone. The evidence. The thing that made this more than just a failed transaction. What had started as a private sale has become a confrontation. Two men in a driveway, one holding a camera, the other wanting it destroyed. The bike forgotten. The money irrelevant now, except as the reason they were standing here. Voices escalating, neither willing to concede. Josh had the recording. Oscar wanted it gone. Neither of them was backing off. Josh demanded the bag back. He demanded Oscar leave. What he got instead was a hand reaching for something else, something that would end the confrontation in a way no recording could prevent. In 11 seconds, Oscar would fire 11 shots. The gun appeared in Oscar's hand. Josh saw it. The phone in his own hand was still recording, camera still pointed at the young man who tried to pay with counterfeit cash moments earlier. What had been a confrontation over money became something else in the time it took to pull a weapon. Josh tried to stop it. Drop it, if you want it all. I'll give it back." De-escalation. The words of a man offering everything to avoid what he could now see coming. The bike, the bag, the counterfeit money. All of it irrelevant if the gun went away. His voice carried none of the sharp command from 30 seconds earlier, just urgency, the tone of someone trying to talk their way out of what was about to happen. Oscar didn't drop it. The first shot came fast, then the second. By the third, any hope of stopping what had started was gone. 11 shots, 11 seconds. The phone captured every sound. The rapid succession of gunfire, Josh's body hitting the pavement, the screaming that followed. Not his voice anymore, but the sound of someone else witnessing what had just happened on a residential street in Hiram, Georgia, on a Saturday afternoon. The confrontation Josh thought he controlled by recording escalated in seconds to 11 gunshots. The ultimate reversal from documenting theft to documenting murder. Seconds earlier, Josh had been in full control of his voice, sharp, commanding, recording evidence. Now there was nothing left but gunfire and screaming. The phone stayed in recording mode. It didn't know to stop when Josh fell, didn't recognize that the hand holding it was no longer gripping with intention. The device kept capturing audio, the aftermath, the chaos, the sounds of a neighborhood reacting to what no one had expected when they woke up that morning. No more words from Josh. No more attempts to negotiate, de-escalate, or document. The recording habit that had preserved his voice through the transaction, the confrontation, and his final plea had done exactly what it was designed to do: capture what happened. What it captured was his murder. Oscar fled, took the bag, the dark blue and black bag containing counterfeit cash mixed with real bills. The object that had started all of this, when Josh examined it too closely. He ran from the scene while Josh lay motionless on the street, phone still recording beside him. Neighbors emerged from their homes. Someone was already calling 911. Someone else was screaming. The ordinary Saturday afternoon in this Hiram subdivision had shattered in the time it took to fire 11 rounds. The phone kept recording after Josh fell, capturing sounds no one should have to hear. When it finally stopped, Josh Swink, father of 3, was lying motionless on a residential street in Hiram, Georgia. He would never speak again. Samantha, still on the phone with dispatch, heard the gunshots from the driveway. Samantha had been standing in the driveway with her 5-year-old son when the shots rang out. She counted 6, maybe 7. Rapid fire from somewhere down the block. The direction Josh had walked minutes earlier after telling her to call the police about the fake money and the attempted theft. 11 had actually been fired. She grabbed her son, ran him and his siblings inside the house, and gave them the only instruction that made sense in the seconds she had before she had to move. Stay inside, lock the doors, don't open for anyone. Then she ran toward the sound. Josh was lying on the street when she reached him, not moving, blood visible on his clothing. The dispatch call she'd placed was still running through her car speakers somewhere nearby, still connected, still waiting for her to describe what was happening, still asking questions she couldn't answer while her hands went to his wound, feeling for a heartbeat, finding it, losing it, finding it again. Neighbors emerged from nearby houses at the sound of gunfire, surrounding Samantha and Josh as she screamed for help. Someone call 911. Someone get an ambulance. Someone do something, because her hands were on his chest and the heartbeat kept slipping away from her fingers. Her hands stayed on his wound, feeling for the heartbeat she kept finding and losing, the only thing that mattered in a moment when nothing else made sense. The neighbors were asking questions. Who did this? Where did he go? Did she see him? She didn't. She had been in the driveway when the shots rang out, too far away to see who had been standing over Josh when the gun fired, too far to see a face, an age, anything that would help identify who had just run from this street. He's running. Is that the guy? Do you see him? Neighbors pointing down the block. Someone had been seen fleeing on foot, moving fast, disappearing around corners before anyone could get a clear look at where he was headed. The subdivision had become a crime scene in the time it took to fire 11 rounds, and the person responsible was already gone. Samantha kept her hands on Josh. The dispatch voice through the car speakers kept asking for details. The neighbors kept pointing. Nothing stopped the blood or brought back the heartbeat that had been there seconds earlier, and now wasn't. Emergency responders were en route. Deputies were being dispatched. The entire apparatus of law enforcement was mobilizing toward this residential street where a Saturday afternoon bike sale had ended with a man lying motionless in front of his own home. But the seconds that mattered had already passed. The killer had already fled. And Josh's phone, still lying where it had fallen, still in recording mode, had captured everything. Neighbors surrounded them, pointing down the street where someone had been seen running. Samantha told them the truth. She didn't know who the man was. She had never once seen his face on her own security cameras. But witnesses had, and they'd seen exactly where he went. Within minutes, deputies flooded the residential area. Deputies from the Paulding County Sheriff's Office responded to multiple calls about shots fired, coordinating over radio to track the fleeing suspect. Witnesses had seen him, a young man running down the street, moving fast, then climbing into a vehicle that was still in the area. Young man, running that direction, got into a car. The description went out over dispatch. White or silver rideshare vehicle, Hispanic male, late teens or early 20s, last seen heading east from the subdivision. The kind of detail that turns a manhunt from a search into a pursuit with a specific target. The radio chatter accelerated, units converging, eyes on the vehicle, preparing to make the stop. Suspect vehicle located, making the stop now. The manhunt that could have taken hours or days resolves in minutes. Excellent witness testimony and radio coordination put Oscar in custody before his rideshare even left the area. Oscar Vega Aguirre sat in the back of the vehicle when deputies pulled it over. No attempt to run, no resistance when they removed him from the car. He was arrested on the spot, placed in handcuffs, and secured in a patrol unit while investigators processed the scene. Inside the rideshare vehicle, deputies recovered a loaded handgun, the weapon that had just fired 11 rounds into Josh Swink was sitting within reach of where Oscar had been riding. Still loaded, still capable of being fired again if the stop had gone differently. Loaded firearm recovered from the vehicle. The gun would be tagged, photographed, entered into evidence. Ballistics would later confirm what everyone already knew. This was the weapon that had killed a man in his own neighborhood.
With us, like recording, we was walking to the street.
The investigators leaned in, watching the footage unfold. Josh, holding the camera, pointed at Oscar, confronting him about the counterfeit bills. Oscar's face visible on screen. No second person, no Dylan with tattoos standing beside him. Just Oscar. Alone. Being called out for trying to steal a dirt bike with fake money. The recording captured what Oscar had claimed to the detective sitting across from him in the interrogation room down the hall. But it also captured what Oscar had left out, what he'd changed, what he'd invented to make himself less culpable than the evidence would show. Oscar had no idea the phone existed. No idea that every word he'd said to Josh, every movement he'd made in that driveway, was sitting on an evidence table waiting to be played back. The footage continued. Josh's voice, Oscar's voice, the escalation from confrontation to threat. Then the sound investigators had been waiting for, the moment that would make every claim Oscar had built in the interrogation irrelevant. Gunfire. 11 shots captured on audio. Josh's phone still recording as he fell, the sounds of the aftermath. Screaming. Chaos. The kind of documentation that turns a he-said situation into objective fact. Run it from the beginning. We need to see everything. The investigators reset the playback. Started from the point where Josh had first pulled out his phone and aimed it at the young man who just handed him a bag full of counterfeit cash. Every second of the recording would be reviewed, every word transcribed, every movement catalogued. Because this wasn't just evidence anymore. It was the truth. Oscar thought he could talk his way around. The proof that no version of the Dylan story would survive once detectives walked this footage into the interrogation room and pressed play. The phone had done exactly what Josh intended when he'd pulled it out and started recording. It had documented what happened. Not Oscar's version. Not a reconstruction based on witness statements or physical evidence or forensic analysis. The actual confrontation. Captured in real time by the man who'd been killed for trying to stop a theft. Every word Josh had said to his killer was on that phone. Every demand Oscar made, every sound after the shots were fired. The recording that would end Oscar's story sat ready to be played back to the one person who thought no one had heard it. And what the footage showed would close every question the interrogation had left open. The footage confirmed everything detectives needed to know. Josh's hands never left the phone. From the moment he'd raised it to record Oscar in his driveway, through the confrontation about the counterfeit cash, up until the first shot was fired, his hands stayed on the device. Filming. Josh's hands never left the phone, no weapon drawn. The recording proves Josh never drew his weapon, eliminating any self-defense claim and confirming Oscar had no justification for the shooting. Samantha's statement about possibly seeing a gun near Josh's body became irrelevant, whatever she'd seen in that traumatic moment. The footage made clear Josh hadn't pulled a weapon during the confrontation, hadn't threatened Oscar, hadn't given him any reason to believe his life was in danger. The detective kept watching. Oscar's face visible on camera, Oscar's voice demanding the phone back, Oscar's movements as the confrontation escalated. And no one else. Only one person visible in frame matches Oscar's description exactly. The footage shows Oscar alone throughout the confrontation. Dylan, the accomplice Oscar described in such detail, never existed. No black man with tattoos standing beside him. No friend who'd pulled the trigger while Oscar helplessly watched. Just Oscar, alone in Josh's driveway, caught on camera trying to steal a dirt bike with counterfeit money, and then shooting the man who'd called him out for it. Every detail Oscar had invented about Dylan, the height, the walk, the tattoos, collapsed under footage that showed only one person standing over Josh when the shots rang out. Self-defense is off the table. Dylan doesn't exist. We have everything we need. The case that had balanced on witness statements and Oscar's fabrications now rested on something that couldn't be argued with. Josh's own voice. Josh's own camera. Josh's own final moments. The recording captured Josh offering to give everything back, captured Oscar demanding the phone, captured the moment when a failed theft turned into 11 gunshots fired in rapid succession, and it captured what came after. The sounds of Josh falling, the chaos, the screaming, all of it preserved on the device that kept recording even after Josh could no longer hold it. For the detective who'd spent hours listening to Oscar construct lies about accomplices and self-defense, the footage was proof, objective, undeniable. The kind of evidence that turns an interrogation from negotiation into confrontation with reality. Oscar had built a story designed to shift blame, minimize culpability, create reasonable doubt. The recording demolished it in the time it took to play back the confrontation from beginning to end. There was still one thing missing from the evidence table: the bag Oscar had carried in, the one containing the counterfeit cash that started everything. Oscar had dropped the gun in his escape, but he'd kept the bag. And now detectives needed to know where it was, and what Oscar would say when confronted with the recording. Back in the interrogation room, the detective slid the evidence across the table. Not the bag Oscar had carried in with the counterfeit cash, not the gun recovered from the rideshare, just a folder, thin, unassuming, holding information that would decide whether the story Oscar had spent hours constructing could survive the next 5 minutes. I want you to know, Oscar, that there's video down there. We have the recording Josh made. Oscar's face registered the weight of what the detective had just said. The phone, the recording. everything Josh had captured before he died. The detective let that sit. Let Oscar do the arithmetic on what a recording might contain, how much it might prove, how many of the claims he'd just made about Dylan, about self-defense, about being a bystander to violence he hadn't caused, would survive footage shot by the man who'd been killed. Oscar didn't ask what was on the recording, didn't ask how much Josh had captured. The questions someone asks when confronted with evidence reveal what they already know is there. Oscar's silence revealed more than any question would have. He knew the phone had been recording. He'd seen Josh holding it. Camera pointed at him, documenting the confrontation that had started over counterfeit money and escalated to gunfire. The detective didn't need to tell Oscar what was on that footage. Oscar had been there when it was made. Before we hear Oscar's answer to that question, comment A if you think he'll confess now. Or B, if you think he'll keep lying, add one reason so we can see how you're reading this moment. Please note, what follows includes some recreated details for narrative purposes. If dramatized interrogation scenes aren't for you, feel free to pause here. Tell me, Oscar, have you told us the truth about everything to date? The pause stretched long. Longer than any answer Oscar had given in the hours they'd been sitting across from each other. The kind of silence that happens when someone is calculating how much is left to deny. Doing arithmetic on what the footage might or might not show. Weighing whether admission or continued fabrication gives them better odds. Seconds passed. The recording equipment in the room captured every moment of hesitation, every beat of silence before Oscar finally answered the question the detective had asked. Yeah, one word, delivered with the certainty of someone who believed the story they'd built. Dylan with the tattoos, self-defense against an armed victim. Being present, but not culpable, could withstand whatever Josh's phone had recorded in those final minutes. When the detective asked if Oscar had told them the truth about everything, the pause stretched long enough to count. Then Oscar said, yes. He had told the truth about everything. He hadn't. And the detective was about to prove it. The detective moved on to questions Oscar hadn't prepared answers for. Not about guilt, not about who pulled the trigger, not even about the phone recording that sat in evidence documenting every claim Oscar had just denied. Instead, the detective asked about logistics. Simple, practical details that anyone telling the truth wouldn't need to calculate before answering. How were you going to get the bike home with no vehicle? ACRF 450 isn't street legal. Oscar hesitated. The kind of pause that happens when someone realizes the answer they need.
You just told me to call around.
Who was your friend?
Miss Taylor.
Dylan? And you said he is a black male?
The detective let the silence build. Let Oscar sit with the weight of how completely the fabrication had unraveled under questions that had nothing to do with murder and everything to do with whether the story made sense in the first place. Dylan wasn't there, was he? It was just Oscar. Right? The pause before Oscar answered felt longer than any that came before it. The recording equipment captured every second of silence, every beat of hesitation, before the truth finally replaced the lie that had consumed hours of interrogation. Yeah, just him. No Dylan, no second shooter. The story Oscar had built across hours of interrogation disappeared in a single word. Now the detective would ask why, and Oscar would have to answer with the truth. The detective's tone changed. Not asking about logistics anymore, not dismantling the Dylan story with questions Oscar couldn't answer. The lies had already collapsed. What remained was getting Oscar to say out loud what the phone recording had already proven, what the witness statements already confirmed, what the detective had known for hours. So the approach shifted from cornering to offering, from evidence to empathy, from proving Oscar wrong to giving him a reason to admit it. You seem like a really good guy. I want what's best for Oscar. The detective invoked Oscar's family, his parents, the people who'd worked hard, come to a new country, done their best to raise him right. The kind of appeal that doesn't appear in forensics reports or witness statements, but sits at the center of every interrogation where someone young has to decide whether to keep lying or start telling the truth. What did your mum and dad teach you about the truth? I want you to think about your mama right now. Oscar's face registered the shift. The detective wasn't attacking anymore, wasn't accusing, was offering something that looked like understanding, like a path through the mess Oscar had made that didn't require him to be a monster, only someone who'd made a terrible choice and now had to own it. The detective let that sit. Let Oscar think about his mother, his father, the people who'd raised him to know right from wrong, even if he'd chosen wrong in Josh's driveway, when the confrontation escalated past the point where any de-escalation could work. This man that was killed, he has a family too that loves him, okay? Inside the detective's approach was a calculation the recording couldn't show, that a young man cornered by facts sometimes needs a door offered to him, even one built entirely from his own family, before he'll walk through it. The interrogation room felt different now, less adversarial, less about catching Oscar in lies and more about giving him permission to stop lying, to say what happened without the fiction of Dylan, without the claim of self-defense, without any of the fabrications that had consumed hours but convinced no one. Oscar sat across the table from someone who'd just spent hours demolishing every claim he'd made. And now that same person was telling him he seemed like a good guy, that his parents had raised him to know the truth mattered, that the man he'd killed had a family who loved him too. The shift was strategic, calculated. The kind of technique that turns interrogations from confrontations into confessions, by making the suspect believe that telling the truth is the only way to honor the people who raised them, the only way to show they're still the person their family thinks they are. The detective asked Oscar one more time to think about his family, about what they'd taught him about truth. Then he asked directly, Dylan wasn't there at all, was he? The confession was one answer away. In the second before Oscar spoke, the detective watched him decide there was no version of this story left to hide inside. It was just me. Oscar finally admits Dylan never existed. The entire elaborate fabrication collapses into 3 words. It was just me. There was no Dylan. The detective let that sit. Hours of interrogation. Hours of building a fictional accomplice with tattoos and a trigger finger. Hours of deflecting blame to someone who'd never stood in Josh's driveway. All of it gone. Replaced with what? The phone recording, the witness statements, and the physical evidence had been saying from the beginning. Just Oscar, alone, no second shooter, no friend who'd panicked and pulled the gun while Oscar watched helplessly. Oscar described what happened, how he'd pulled the gun when Josh confronted him about the counterfeit cash, how Josh had tried to de-escalate. offering to give everything back, trying to talk his way out of what was about to happen. How the first shot came, then the second, then more in rapid succession. 11 shots, 11 seconds. The detective already knew the count from the recording, from the forensics, from the witness accounts of the gunfire that shattered a quiet Saturday afternoon in Hiram. But then Oscar described what came after, the detail that made the detective's face go still, that turned confession from admission into something colder. In the second before Oscar said it, the detective watched the exact moment a young man decided there was no version of this story left to hide inside. No more lies. No more Dylan. Just the plain fact of what he'd done after Josh went down. Oscar hadn't stopped, hadn't run, hadn't dropped the gun and fled immediately. He'd stood over Josh, a man he'd already shot multiple times, a man who was no longer a threat, if he ever had been, and made a decision. Why did you shoot him after you had already shot him? The question hung in the interrogation room. Not about the first shots, not about the confrontation, not about the moment when things escalated from theft to violence, about what happened after, about standing over someone who'd been shot and choosing to pull the trigger again. Oscar reveals the most chilling detail. He stood over Josh after the initial shooting and fired again, not in panic or self-defense, but because Josh was still moving. Because he was moving. 4 words. No elaboration, no claim that he'd felt threatened or believed Josh was reaching for something or thought his own life was still in danger. Just the cold arithmetic of someone lying on the ground, still moving, and Oscar deciding that required more bullets. The detective had heard confessions before, had sat across from people who'd killed in rage, in fear, in desperation, in self-defense gone wrong. This wasn't any of those. This was someone describing a choice made while standing over a dying man. A calculation about whether Josh was moving enough to justify finishing what had already been started. He had stood over a man he'd already shot, a father of 3 named Josh Swink, and pulled the trigger again. The reason. The only explanation any interrogation or court record would ever contain was 4 words. Because he was moving. But there was still one piece of evidence Oscar had kept. The bag that started everything. The detective needed to know what Oscar had done with the evidence. The confession was complete. No Dylan, just Oscar. 11 shots, including the final rounds, while Josh lay moving on the ground. But without the physical evidence, questions remained. Where was the gun? Where was the bag full of counterfeit cash that had started everything? Where's the gun now? What did you do with it? Oscar described his escape. Running from the scene after the shots stopped, fleeing through the subdivision on foot, panic driving every step. Somewhere, in those first frantic minutes, he'd made a decision about the weapon still in his possession. I dropped it, in the woods when I was running, getting rid of the murder weapon. The smart move for someone trying to distance themselves from what they'd just done. Deputies would later search those woods and recover it. But in the moment, the gun's disposal made sense, discarded, left behind, in the desperate attempt to escape. Then the detective asked about the bag. The dark blue and black bag Oscar had carried into the transaction. The one containing the counterfeit cash Josh had discovered and called out as fake before pulling his phone to record. The bag that proved this hadn't been random violence, but a planned theft that escalated to murder. And the bag, he kept the bag. Why would someone drop the murder weapon but keep the bag of counterfeit cash, the very evidence that connected him to the motive? that proved premeditation, that showed this wasn't random violence, but a planned theft gone wrong. Yeah, Oscar couldn't explain it. Couldn't offer a reason for why he'd thrown away the gun that linked him to the shooting, but held on to the bag that linked him to the crime's origin. The detective pressed, why keep it? Why not discard everything that connected him to Josh's driveway? No.
If you enjoyed today's video, 85% of our viewers aren't subscribed, so if this is the kind of content you come back for.
Oscar sat across from him, unable to articulate why he'd made the decision he had. Why panic had told him to drop one piece of evidence, but hold on to another, just as damning, even mid-confession, surrounded by the wreckage of every lie he'd told. Oscar had made a choice that defied explanation. The murder weapon went into the woods. The bag stayed with him. Why would he drop the gun and keep the bag? Even the detective wanted to know. The bag Oscar refused to abandon, the one containing the counterfeit cash. The black gloves, the knit cap, was about to become the final piece of evidence he'd hand over himself. And Oscar was about to tell them exactly where to find it. First house on the left, Oscar told them. The detectives looked at each other. After hours of lies, half-truths, and invented accomplices, Oscar Vega Aguirre was now giving them precise directions to evidence he could have simply thrown away. The bag he'd risked his freedom to keep was hidden exactly where he said, at the subdivision entrance, back porch, under a bucket. First house on the left, under the back porch, in a bucket. Officers were dispatched immediately. The subdivision Oscar had fled through after shooting Josh Swink was less than 2 miles from the Paulding County Sheriff's Office. They arrived within minutes, approached the first house on the left, and made their way to the back porch. There, tucked beneath an overturned bucket, was a dark blue and black bag. Inside, counterfeit cash, black gloves, a knit cap, exactly as Oscar had described. "We've got it," the officer radioed back. "Bag recovered, contents match description." In the interview room, the detectives nodded. They'd already logged Oscar's confession, already marked the location where he claimed to have dropped the gun. And now they had the physical proof he'd been carrying when he approached Josh Swink that afternoon. The bag wasn't just evidence, it was a timeline. It confirmed motive, confirmed intent, confirmed Oscar had come prepared. Counterfeit cash, gloves, cap, everything he said would be there. Here's what makes this moment so strange. Oscar could have told them nothing. He could have said he lost the bag, buried it, threw it in a dumpster miles away. He could have given them a dozen false locations and bought himself time. But he didn't. He directed them straight to it, as if the weight of carrying that secret, knowing exactly where it was, had become too much. Maybe he wanted to prove he was telling the truth now. Maybe he thought cooperation would help him later. Or maybe, after hours of lying about Dylan, about self-defense, about everything, this was the one thing he could control, the moment he stopped running. The bag was logged into evidence and photographed. Crime scene technicians documented each item, the fake bills that had triggered the entire confrontation, the gloves Oscar had worn, the cap he'd pulled over his head. Prosecutors would later use these items to establish premeditation, to show that Oscar hadn't stumbled into a spontaneous conflict, but had arrived equipped and ready. Back at the station, the detectives reviewed what they had. Oscar's full confession on tape, Josh Swink's 911 call capturing the moment the transaction went wrong, the location of the discarded firearm in the woods, and now the recovered bag with all its contents intact. The case was physically complete. Every piece of evidence Oscar had touched, carried, or abandoned had been found, documented, and secured. The investigation had moved from questions to answers, from theories to certainty. What remained now wasn't a mystery. It was a matter of charges, sentencing, and consequence. And Oscar was about to learn exactly what those would be. The charges filed against Oscar Vega Aguirre told one story. The charges he would face in court told another. Initially, prosecutors charged him with malice murder, felony murder, and aggravated assault charges that reflected what the evidence showed a man who approached Josh Swink with counterfeit money initiated the confrontation, chased him down, and shot him twice while he was trying to escape. The confession was on tape. The physical evidence matched. The 911 recording captured Josh Swink's final moments in real time. Then the Paulding County District Attorney's Office made a decision that would reshape the entire case. They reduced the charges to manslaughter. The reasons weren't made public in detail: legal strategy, plea negotiations, considerations about what a jury might do. These calculations happened behind closed courtroom doors. But the result was clear. What had been prosecuted as deliberate murder would now be tried as something lesser: a killing without malice, a death caused by reckless conduct rather than intent. In court, the judge addressed Oscar's attempt to claim self-defense. The court finds that the defendant initiated the confrontation, the judge stated. There is no claim of self-defense available under these circumstances. He couldn't argue he'd been protecting himself from a man he had chased, a man who was running away, a man who had called the police for help. The law was clear. The aggressor doesn't get to claim fear. But here's the irony that sat heavy in that courtroom. Josh Swink had done everything right. He had retreated. He had not escalated. He had called for help. His phone had recorded his own murder, and the law called it manslaughter. Outside the courtroom, the sentiment was blunt. He shot a man in the back while he was trying to get away, one observer said. They're calling it manslaughter. The sentencing came next. 20 years in prison, followed by 5 years of probation. Oscar would be required to serve a mandatory minimum of 9 years before he could even be considered for parole. The numbers were read into the record. Years broken down into months, months into the minimum days Oscar would spend behind bars before the possibility of freedom. But no number could measure what Josh Swink had lost. No sentence could calculate the Saturday mornings his children would spend without him, the graduations he wouldn't attend, the ordinary hours that add up to a life. Then came the final administrative detail. Immigration and Customs Enforcement issued a detainer on Oscar Vega Aguirre. After serving his sentence in Georgia, he would be deported to Guatemala. The legal system had processed him, judged him, and would eventually send him home. The case was closed. Oscar Vega Aguirre would serve his sentence. He would be deported. The investigation was complete. The evidence logged. The outcome decided. But the label the legal system had placed on Josh Swink's death, manslaughter, not murder, would remain as permanent as the recording on his phone. Josh Swink's phone recorded his own murder. But what it captured was more than evidence. The recording became the backbone of the case, the one piece of testimony that couldn't be cross-examined, couldn't misremember, couldn't change under pressure. When Oscar invented Dylan. when he claimed self-defense, when he tried to reshape what happened into something survivable in court. The recording simply played back the truth. Josh's habit of documenting everything gave investigators what most cases never have: objective certainty. They had his voice, live, as the confrontation unfolded. The recording captured Josh retreating, not escalating, calling for help, not threatening violence. A man trying to de-escalate a situation that had already spiraled beyond his control. And then it captured the gunshots that ended his life.
Why did you shoot him after you had already shot him?
He was moving.
He was moving? Were you mad at him? You weren't mad at him? Were you just...
Josh was already hit, already down, already dying. The first shot had done its work. The second shot, the one Oscar fired while Josh was on the ground because he was moving, wasn't survival. It wasn't panic. It was something the audio documented but couldn't explain. Recordings capture what happened, but they do not capture why. That question, why continue? Why not stop? Why pull the trigger again? Remained unanswered even after the confession, even after the sentencing. Oscar's words gave investigators sequence and admission. The recording gave them proof, but motivation stayed locked behind the facts. Then there was the bag. Oscar had dropped the gun in the woods while running. A smart move, the kind of decision that suggests clarity under pressure. Ditch the weapon, eliminate the direct link, make the case harder to prove. But he couldn't leave the bag. The counterfeit money that had started everything. The black gloves he'd worn, the knit cap. All of it still tucked under a bucket at the first house on the left when he finally told detectives where to find it. He'd carried it through the subdivision, hidden it carefully. And then, when the walls closed in, directed police straight to it. Why keep it? The bag held evidence that directly tied him to premeditation, to intent, to the fact that he'd come prepared. And yet, he couldn't let it go. Maybe it was the cash. Maybe it was the instinct to hold on to something after losing everything else. Or maybe the bag was simply the one thing he knew he still controlled. On the morning of October 14th, 2023, Josh Swink had no reason to believe this Saturday would be different from any other. He was a father of 3, a man who documented transactions and kept records, someone who believed that doing things the right way mattered. He died doing what he had always done, documenting the moment. Oscar Vega Aguirre was caught holding what he could not let go. The recording and the bag one captured the truth. The other proved it. Josh Swink's story ends with a recording that captured everything and a bag that proved it all. What remains is the memory of a father of 3 who believed in doing things the right way. Josh's habit of recording, something so routine, became the evidence that told the truth when lies tried to bury it. His voice, preserved on that phone, gave investigators the certainty most cases never have. That recording honored him in a way no one could have predicted. This case reminds us that truth has a way of surfacing, even when it's hidden under a bucket at the first house on the left. Oscar Vega Aguirre's confession. The recovered evidence. The recording that documented everything. Each piece told the same story. But it also reminds us that justice and closure are not always the same thing. The charges were reduced. The label was changed. and a family was left to carry the weight of a Saturday that started like any other. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Leave a comment below sharing your thoughts on this case. What stood out to you most? And if you know someone who would appreciate hearing Josh's story, please share it with them. These stories matter because the people in them mattered. Thank you for listening with respect and attention. This story is based on the real case of Josh Swink, who was killed in Hiram, Georgia, on October 14th, 2023. Some scenes have been dramatized for narrative purposes, but the core facts, the evidence, the confession, the outcome, remain true to what happened. Our thoughts are with Josh's family and everyone affected by this tragedy.